Hello, beautifuls. You're listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Brooke Thomas, and I'll be joined soon by my very dear friend and co-host, Vanessa Scotto. So on the show, we're talking about being students on the embodied spiritual path, and what does that actually mean? So what is a real evolution of our lives, and how do we embrace everything, the beauty and crazy, the joys and messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life? We're attempting to sort that out for ourselves as we go along through each episode. In today's show, we're opening the door to the inner world of Sensies, otherwise known as the spiritually sensitive people. So Vanessa and I have used this phrase for years together and we identify as Sensies to describe a certain quality of person. And today we're getting into what exactly is a spiritually sensitive person. How does being sensitive inform your life and your beliefs? Does it indicate a predisposition towards spiritual paths? From discussions on culture and psychology to introversion versus extroversion to why a Sensie may be prone to loading their suitcases full of remedies before a meditation retreat, we're diving into the subtle realities of the highly sensitive person. So get ready to be overstimulated, our Sensie people. Before we dive in, if you're enjoying the show, we would love to hear from you. And so if you have a moment to write a review on iTunes, that would be so very appreciated. It helps us to know how we're doing and not feel like we're in a total vacuum. And it also makes it easier for people to find the show so we can grow this, hopefully, into a nice, nourishing community. Lastly, if you're unfamiliar with the show, just to note that we do have a wee bit the potty mouth, so headphones in if little ones are around. Okay, here we go.
So there's nothing more intriguing than trying to figure out how to start one of these conversations.
No doubt.
But I want to talk today about the topic of the spiritually sensitive person. And that's Judith Blackstone's terminology. And of course, we just came off of her retreat not too long ago, so it's been on my mind. But you and I have been talking forever about what we like to call the Sensie personality, which I got one day when I was watching the show Scrubs, if any of you listeners are old enough to remember this show Scrubs. And JD goes off into a reverie and he's talking to this doctor who, heaven forbid, has feelings in this hospital. And he's looking at this doctor and his fellow feeling mate and he's like, come on, us Sensies need to stick together. And it just kind of occurred to me in that hilarious little meme that so often we don't talk about our feelings as a culture. We don't talk about how deeply moved we can be by each other and by our environment. And I kind of always loved the term Sensie, and it was like a match for me and certainly for you, Brooke, right away. So I don't know, maybe we could dive in just by saying, what do you think a Sensie is to you and kind of work our way up to the spiritually sensitive person?
Yeah, you and I have been using the word Sensie for a long time. We're so Sensie. And certainly there's a well-articulated movement's probably too strong a word, but the highly sensitive person is something that's been clarified and talked about a lot. It's been helpful to us to understand that HSPs are a thing and that we're real and we can be validated sometimes.
We're here. We take up space with all of our sensitive feelings. And we're normal.
And we're normal in a culture that doesn't value these things. Yeah, like for me, I feel like without articulating it to myself at all, because it took many years before that, but I realized I was a Sensie when my brother, who's also a Sensie, hi, Rob, outing you as a fellow Sensie. We moved from Southern California to Massachusetts when I was almost 6 and he was almost 3, I guess. And then we lived there all of our growing up until we graduated high school. And we spent from the moment he and I landed there, we've always been really close to all of our years growing up, just kind of being like, where are we? Like, what planet is this? It was planet not Sensie. And for whatever reason, like this neighborhood had a particular flavor of that. And part of it is just if anyone is from south of Boston, and I don't mean Southie as it's been glamorized in movies and stuff. I grew up further south than Southie in the like really lame suburbs of Boston, but there's still a lot of like rough and tumble fighting Irish, like push first, ask questions later kind of mentality. And so we came from what probably felt like a more natural environment, or at least we didn't feel like we stuck out in Southern California in those early years, the way that we did in Massachusetts. And it was just a lot of, he and I, thank God we had each other, looking at each other all the time and just being like, what is going on here with all these other kids? Like, what is the deal? Because everyone seemed so armored and tough. And then, of course, there's also like just a totally normative level of not Sensey.
Well, I mean, the Northeast in general, having grown up in New York City, I think is a much less sensitively inclined culture than California. Mm-hmm. So you already have a typical style of armoring and of sarcasm and all of these wonderful things that we learn and adopt in the Northeast that aren't as prevalent in California. And then, of course, you have this other level that I think you're starting to articulate, which is that even within cultural norms, there's still a difference person to person in this level of sensitivity.
Yeah. And so I feel like it's probably worth saying what some of the things are, none of which, by the way, is, you know, just for those listening, is me having like a list I'm reading from that's complete, you know? So this is just us talking off the top of our heads. But, you know, there's emotional sensitivity, there's energetic sensitivity, there's sensitivity to physical environment comfort, there's health sensitivity, food stuff, autoimmune stuff, sleep stuff. So when we say Sensey, we mean the feeling sort, but also that everything I think you feel more permeable than most, and it affects really every category of your life. Everything feels too much.
Actually, when you just said all of those categories, I was thinking, right, like you're describing a highly sensitive person, right? 'Cause
yeah.
I feel like we all, once you're sensitive, you seem to hit most of those notes, right? Mm-hmm. Like your food sensitivity and health sensitivity and environmental sensitivity and energetic and emotional sensitivity. And maybe we can start by defining sensitivity, because it's always kind of pissed me off that culturally people will say things like, you're too sensitive. And it seems to imply like this, you're fucked up kind of a terminology.
Yeah,
like,
or get it together.
It's so bad. Like, how could you feel anything? It's horrible. And so even if I say to people, I mean, I have friends who are therapists, right? So clearly they value emotions. And if I said to them, oh, I think you might fall into the classification of highly sensitive person, like they don't want that. Nobody wants to be called sensitive. So let's maybe start with that word. So think about sensitive. In my mind, I think of it as like highly receptive too. So people who are sensies or spiritually sensitive or HSP, whatever language you resonate with, they tend to be like big antennas. They're just picking up on the subtle vibrations in an environment. Right? And subtle vibrations, that can be sound, that can be energy, it can be emotion. I mean, I guess actually it's all energy, but we can categorize it into these different things. So we're really talking more about imagining like a nervous system that's so highly attuned that it can pick up on more of the subtle levels that aren't striking other people's nervous system with that level of intensity. Does that make sense to you?
Totally. Yeah. There's just more amplitude, you know, and to your point about people not wanting to be put in the category, what Sensey is not necessarily is poopy baby, which is a phrase created by my gorgeous son. It's his joke phrase for when he wants to be a little bit more mothered. And he'll joke with me, but what he really means is, I want to cuddle today. But what he'll say, I'm a poopy baby, so poopy baby has become our perfect phrase for when I'm having those moments, me as an adult, where I'm like, come on, world, just take a little more care of me today. So poopy baby is fine, but we're not talking about this kind of across the board, whiny, my diapers are overfull kind of mode.
Ew, so gross. I'm so sorry you went there.
I'm sorry. I'm gross sometimes. The ways that I am not Sensey include my grossness. So it's this porousness, which makes it sound like it's also about diffuse boundaries. And I think that can happen sometimes with sensitivity, but it's not necessarily what we're talking about either. But because you're a more receptive antenna, you do have to find ways to manage that, particularly in a world that doesn't value sensitivity. Like I was reading an article on education recently that was talking about what they're calling the weird cultures, which is us. So Western educated, now I'm going to forget them all, industrialized, rich, and democratic. The weird cultures that are doing things in this article's case. I'll link to it in the show notes, where we're creating these parameters for what it means to be normative in our educational system versus non-normative. And so it was comparing it to a lot of different indigenous cultures' ways of rearing and educating children and how they view learning and how they view children, really. And there was really one, I think it was from the Aboriginal culture, a quote that was like, well, children are born all different ways. I'm paraphrasing. And you have to know if your child is the priest or the warrior and raise them accordingly. And there used to be these places that held these ideas that the sensitive people were exceptionally valuable to their community. Because the sensitive people were more sensitive. They could be better receptors to what might be going on under the surface of things. That's actually really, really super valuable. But in the weird cultures, the Western educated, blah, blah, blah cultures, we don't really make space for that so much. And we really are trying to, I think probably from the time of the agricultural age, but certainly since the industrial age, we're trying to make people cogs in a machine that we've defined a certain way. So there's just not room, there's not room to say like, oh, the child who is having, night terrors or whatever, once they start going to school, it's really like get it together is always the orientation, as opposed to like, wow, what is this child maybe trying to tell us about how the community of school is organized or what might be going on in the social interactions at school. So I think that it's really intriguing to think about it on a cultural level, because so much has gotten lost when we just put the sensitive people into the like, get over it and get yourself together already category. We really lose a lot of very, very refined information about our worlds and our communities and the health of our culture and our communities. Because those are the people historically that are tapped into the pulse underneath the sort of more solid forms of our lives.
Sure. I think it's really interesting to look at. I actually get kind of like impassioned about the cultural level, mostly because I've been traumatized at the cultural level.
As all sensies have in our culture.
As we have. And I do get really intrigued because we are a culture that kind of values things like extroversion and assertiveness and confidence and speaking your mind. We tend to value these types of qualities. And we create like a measuring stick, right? Like if you can measure up to these qualities, you're doing well, you get validated in our society. And if you're looking at the world a different way, a more introverted way, a more intuitive way, a more, embodied way, you tend to come off as really weird, not just the way that they defined it, but really non-normative. And so there's that. And I'm in agreement. I feel like when you look at these different cultures cross-culturally and also over time, you would imagine that what would happen is they would be identified as a shaman, as a priest, as a medicine woman. Mm-hmm. They would be identified, and there would be a role within your culture that would welcome you to bring forward your gifts, that would welcome you to take care of yourself the way a sensitive person needs to take care of yourself. A shaman spent a lot of time in the woods by themselves. There's a reason for that. Mm-hmm. So I do think the cultural piece is important, A, just because it fascinates me, so I'm glad to chit chat about it, but B, because I think what's happened for a lot of us, why I get like really worked up over it, is I grew up in a culture. My family is Italian, and but second, I guess first generation. I mean, we grew up here, but my parents were from Italy, whatever that makes us. And the only feelings they were very comfortable with were anger. They didn't like to talk about how you were. They didn't ask you what things meant to you. We weren't talking about God. We weren't talking about spirituality. And here I am. I'm growing up a kid. I'm 7 years old. I'm dreaming about reincarnation. I'm thinking about the meaning of life. I'm fascinated and obsessed with death and like how I'm going to die and what it's going to mean. And all of these things are happening. And I feel every emotion in my house, everything people are going through. Like my parents fought like cats and dogs, and they screamed at the top of their lungs. And when I would shake and say like, my God, you guys are so loud, my parents would say, we're just talking.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe they really meant that, but you have people like us, these sensies, and the environment's having this very big influence over us. And one of the things that's like an attribute that people will commonly attribute to the highly sensitive person, or as Judith would call it, the spiritually sensitive person, is that not only are you highly aware of your environment, you are highly aware of your internal environment. And by proxy of all of this inward focus, one of the things that commonly shows up is you seem to think you've done something wrong. It's like if I notice that something in my environment has shifted, someone went from happy to sad, for example, as I tune inward, the next question seems to follow, what did I do to create this thing in my environment? And I don't know why they're linked. It could be that sensies are born from trauma. I mean, there's a lot of different theories on what makes a highly sensitive person. I don't know why they're linked, but they do seem commonly linked. So as a sensitive person is constantly feeling these different fluctuations, there's this tendency to go, what did I do? And what can I do differently? Which means there's a tendency to create high levels of responsibility for their environment, to create a self-deprecating, self-defeating type of personality, to feel really bad. And now you take this structure, this personality structure, and you put us out into a world that also thinks that having feelings is problematic, that what you're experiencing in the seen and unseen worlds is crazy. Like you can't be seeing ghosts, or you can't be anxious because a storm is coming, or you can't be talking to trees, which are some of the more abstract Sensey traits, but I digress. And you feel even more crazy. And I can't tell you how many people I see that are Sensey clients. And it breaks my heart because we all feel so weird and wrong somehow.
Yeah. Like we've lost our place. And because we've lost our place, we wind up just kind of swirling. And we do, I think, wind up more. And again, not knowing what the root of a highly sensitive person is. I just think that all cultures have some people who are highly sensitive. But of course, we could, look more at what makes a person sensitive. Is it born of trauma, all that kind of thing. But without without having to like shove people into these categories, we get lost. There's no authority behind what we're experiencing. And so we wind up maybe in more codependent type roles, where the caretaking of other people's needs distracts us from our own feelings. But like if you're sensitive in a world that devalues sensitivity, certainly you're going to just like baseline not feel great about yourself and then try to do things to manage that, to be likable, to seem more outgoing. I'm reading the book right now that I think it's gotten pretty popular, so maybe a lot of people have heard of it or read it, but called Quiet. Have you read this yet?
I haven't read it, but I've heard about it.
It's so good. And she does such an articulate job of talking about the place that, for her, she's talking about introverts, the place that introverts have in society. And she traces the history in our culture, particularly in the United States, but definitely Western world, of the extrovert ideal. And she talks about how in the United States, we went from, early days, we're still a really young country. Early days, we really valued, there was this culture of character. We really valued the strong, silent type that would make all their decisions based on their deep intrinsic values. Like that was our value culturally. And then not suddenly, but it transformed into this culture of personality and how big can you be? How extroverted can you be? And a lot of this is tied to stuff that I'll let her explain in the book, but economy and how things changed, when we're no longer running our family farms and suddenly we are in corporate boardrooms, but it's just fascinating to think about how recent that transition is. And this is obviously still way removed from a more indigenous culture where we like really value that these people hold a critical linchpin position in our community. We're already way away from that. But like now we're even just, it's like, God forbid somebody come off as shy, in elementary school. It's like, oh, well, they're doomed to fail because they're shy and sensitive. And so we'd really better train that out of them and train them how to fake extroversion and to fake being a big, interesting personality. And it makes me so sad to think of everything that's got lost. And also, one of the things that she points out in the book is like so many of our successful leaders of companies, of all of these different major things that are really relevant to modern culture, they're actually the introverts, the big, flashy, loud ones. I'm not going to have a political conversation in our election year, but you know who I'm thinking about. Like these are people that can seem very impressive, very compelling, very attractive. But at the end of the day, do they make decisions based on feeling the pulse of what's best for the whole community? And it's like, no, not really, because it's culture of personality. It's about what gets the most attention or is the flashiest. And certainly it's just thinking about themselves. So in veering away from having any value on sensitivity at all, we've lost a lot. I think we're seeing that.
I feel like I could go on a rant about how I hate when we treat people like they should all be the same, but I'm not going to. You can all just fill in the blanks on that, like the way we educate kids like they're all the same, and we judge people if they don't act and feel and think like us and all of that, which I think is one of our major dilemmas is people who are traumatized in relationships, is people pulling for us to be like them, even when we're not. But I'm not going to go too far into that. I thought maybe it could be useful for us to describe how this sensitivity shows up in our lives and kind of the interesting and not so interesting techniques we've used to kind of
some of them are not so interesting.
Because I feel like, one day, I guess at 33 was when I went to school to become a psychologist or, to study psychology. And it was around that time that I started to get hip, like, oh my God, there's this thing called highly sensitive person. Now, I hate being labeled. It's not my thing to put everything into a box. But there was like all of a sudden this enormous relief that was like, oh my God, 20% of the population is like me, that this is a thing and it's a thing that's describable. I already felt relief. And that's actually a very common experience when I talk about this with other people. And with it comes this curiosity of like, okay, well, what does this mean for me? Like, what does this mean that I do? And how do I act? And how do I deal with the fact that my world oftentimes feels so overstimulating that even though I don't even know if I'm technically an introvert, I wind up staying home a lot to kind of like escape stimulation. Like, how do I cope with all of this? So does that sound interesting to kind of go into like how is life for you as a Sensey, and like what are some of the things you're doing about that?
Yeah, when I haven't valued what might be really useful for me in my environment, it didn't go great. You know, I was an urban pioneer for a while in Red Hook, and I lived across the street from the house that ran most of the drugs for the neighborhood. There were lots of dog fighting rings. There was the biggest methadone clinic in the city on the corner. Someone got shot and killed in front of my apartment. There was just a loud bus stop in front of my apartment. Not a Sensey environment. And it really wore on me. And I think it's funny because but I hadn't yet learned to really, that it's okay to value what I need, you know. And these days I live in a town my house is a block from the beach. I go hiking every morning. Like, these are things that actually are critically important to my health. And they don't just help me to hide, right? Because like hiding as a strategy, not particularly useful. It's one I've used plenty, but finding those things that are actually deeply nourishing and regenerative, and saying like, yeah, I need that. I'm a morning person. I go to bed early. I don't eat these kinds of foods. I don't, you know, just because this is what I need to actually feel good and vital in the world.
Yeah, you know, I had that moment where I was talking to Kieran, one of my mentors, not too long ago, and I was describing to her how I was in Vancouver, and Vancouver was wildly overstimulating to me. I was by a methadone clinic. I was on a very loud block, and it was just, my system was going crazy, which was presenting as like anxiety, inability to connect with my body, to connect with myself. And I was saying to Kieran, you know, I guess sensitivity has like two sides of a coin, and it has these gifts. I'm just incredibly empathetic. I'm really in tune. It's fun being spiritually aware, you know, all of these different things, but, you know, comes with these challenges, like in my environment, et cetera. And my Kieran was like, well, you would think of it like that. And I was like, what? And she's like, you know, because it's not a challenge. The challenge is you've come to see it as wrong. And so you've never set up your life in a way that just supports you, because you've never seen it as natural, because you see it as a challenge instead of like just this beautiful thing in nature that just needs this different way of engaging, you know, not good, bad, right, wrong, challenge, unchallenged, which was, you know, revelatory to me. And that was only, 6 months ago. So I keep deepening into this because I'm sure a lot of you listening are sensitive people, or you probably wouldn't be so interested in the conversations we've had already. And a lot of people in healing professions can be sensitive people. We kind of flock there because we've been through so much, and we were always looking for tools, right, to support ourselves. So I think that it's like this ever evolving thing where at first I just was trying to manage my symptoms, right? So if any of you have ever seen me and Brooke go on retreat.
I was totally going to bring that up.
If you were ever to witness Brooke and I go on a retreat together, you would be laughing as hard as we have, because we panic run to health food stores. We buy every remedy we could need, because, you know, if you go to Crestone, Colorado, you can't leave. You can't get to a drugstore. You can't. So part of being sensitive is we get uncomfortable easily. We have physical realities, like we tend to be sensitive to foods. We tend to be sensitive to noises. We can get sick a lot. That can all be a part of the story until, as Judith says, you learn to embody, but, you know, that for later. But that can all be a part of the story. You also seem to have a penchant for delicious tasting things, a very refined palate. So as Brooke and I prepare, we run out, we buy a bunch of things so we can manage symptoms and so we can calm our anxiety that will be uncomfortable, because being uncomfortable for a Sensey feels major. It's almost like I'm already uncomfortable by so many things in my environment that if I physically go out of balance, it's like more than I can bear mentally. We seem to have a love for food. So you'll always see me and Brooke go run and get some treatsies to, again, restore comfort via nourishment. So at first, I think, and I know you know, Brooke, a lot of what we do is we learn to manage our environment. We stay away from friends that are demanding or too loud. We start to learn that different environments that are quiet suit us, and we learn to take walks in nature, and we get remedies, and we have nutritionists and massage therapists and rolfers and therapists.
Yep.
And don't be ashamed. We need those. We all do that. And then I think where you and I are currently at, so, you're all meeting us in exactly this place on our journey, is we're learning to embody and to embrace and to make this deep contact so that hopefully the energy doesn't feel so abrasive against our very tender nerve endings, but rather is recognized as this oneness and can just move in and through us with a different harmony. That's the transformational level. I am really still working on that myself.
Yeah. And I think that that's going to be, lifelong unfolding for both of us just because of how we're wired, but probably worth mentioning just a little bit. We just finished the first part of our realization process training with Judith Blackstone, who we keep mentioning in this conversation. And she wrote a book, Belonging Here, about spiritually sensitive people. And so the tools that we learned and are learning with her are so tremendously useful in maintaining all the sensitivity you have, and even really letting it come through as much as it wants to come through. I wouldn't say amplifying it, because it's not like you're trying to push it bigger, but you're just letting it exist instead of trying to shoo it away. And yet also dealing with some of the major challenges that we have, like making sure that we know how to be grounded, that we don't have to hide all the time from loud environments, that we don't have to constantly be sort of anxiously attending to our own comfort in advance, which is what you and I are always laughing about with each
good
other.
At it.
Okay, I might be slightly uncomfortable, so
I better pack my pillow.
Oh my God, do I have magnesium before sleep at night? They don't have the brand I like. So, that's a very anxious and like jumping out in front of yourself way to live all the time. So how can you deeply settle into your body and feel like there's space for you to feel all those feelings, and that they don't yank you around at their whim? That you can be attending to yourself. You can be attending to your environment, whether it's a person or a bus stop that's loud outside, or, shitty food that isn't going to make you feel good. And that you can do these things from a place that experientially that there is this part of you that is whole and imperturbable, if that's the right word, that it can't be, disrupted and blown about, that you're as a sensitive person, you're actually much more substantive than you think you are. And I think in part that's because we feel everything so much, but it's also because we grew up with lots of messages of, why are you so sensitive? Stop being so sensitive. Why can't you just suck it up? And so we really have taken that to heart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It occurs to me that it would be probably useful, at least interesting for me, to talk about how sensitivity can predispose us to trauma, because I'm sure a lot of people listening have kind of reshaped themselves, like learned to hide energetically, learned to kind of float energetically, learned thin skin, which is one of my things, because we're so aware of the needs and feelings of our environment, which are impossible to meet. And we're so quick to take it on like we should be able to, that it really does lead to these patterns of engagement that can then keep showing up relationally. So I do think that at another time, maybe we can get there because it's, about time to wrap this up. But maybe where we can start, all of us, you and I and everyone listening, is just making some space that we have a right to exist as we are, like accepting this as part of the beautiful spectrum that is human nature. No better, no worse, but certainly needed, certainly welcomed. And I think just acceptance was maybe one of the biggest, most powerful things I could do, because once I accepted it, I understood better, like, oh, this is what serves me, this is what doesn't. Then I could start to exercise my power of choice, because before then, I really was kind of like what she was saying in that book, Quiet. I was just trying to live up to an ideal because I thought that was ideal and that anything that wasn't that was not quite normal. And then the pressure was on me to go ahead and fix it and do all those things you and I like talk about. Like, I'll make a life coaching list and set goals, and then I'll be that person. And
yep.
So maybe if we can all just kind of commit together about this idea of just beginning to accept that there's like a rainbow of assortments of how we can be as human beings. And this is a very viable, wonderful, welcome part of the human experience. That could be some good magic just there.
Yeah. And I'm tempted to, I used to, on my other show, Liberated Body, always end with what I called home play, like something to play with in your own body. And in terms of a practical takeaway, there's so many different things, but like simple, short bullet point thing to do is if you're feeling overwhelmed by your environment, if there's a lot of emotional gunking in the environment and you're feeling like you need to go fix it or whatever it is, just go into your feet. It's just a very simple, there's so much more to say about that, but as the most basic instruction, can you feel that you are inside your own feet? And I find that is at the very least a nice little stopgap stabilizing. I'm here. I'm home. I exist. And these things are still going on. It's okay for me to still be the antenna that I am. But I can start to get in, and getting in on that ground level where you feel literally grounded can be really tremendously useful. So play with that if you're a Sensey out there and you need a little something, something right now. Thank you so much for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any resources that we might have mentioned while we were talking, always live at blissandgrit.com. If you go to the website and scroll down, you will see each episode's separate posts there, and the resources are within the individual posts. You can also come hang out with us on the social media channel of your choice, although we are much more frequently on Instagram and Facebook than anywhere else, and we are Bliss and Grit at those spots. If you want to support the show, you can write us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, which helps to let us know how we're doing. It helps other people to find the show, which would be delightful. If technology isn't your thing, but you are enjoying the show, then you can just tell your friends who you think it might genuinely resonate with. Huge gratitude to all of you who have written reviews thus far. Our latest one has come in from KJJJJ515, and they write, quote, "These women are so down to earth, so real, that I am able to feel comfortable listening to spiritual talk. It's easy to feel out of place with some spiritual podcasts, even though that's what's most important to me. Brooke and Vanessa feel real, honest, aware, and still humble. I love the topics they've chosen so far, and I can't wait for more. Thank you so very much, O K of the many J's." And we'll be back next week.